Good morning, folks. I'll be honest, they told me that I was presenting the morning after the party, so I didn't expect many of you to actually show up. It's a beautiful day in San Diego. The party was a little intense last night. I'm still looking for the guys on stilts. They haven't come into the keynote room yet. So I do want to talk to you about the relationship between AWS and DBT Labs. But we can't have that conversation without having a conversation about open source. And so if you'll permit me a little bit, I'm gonna not really talk about AWS a whole lot during this presentation. I want to talk about open source. Quinn told you that I'd been involved in open source for 2 decades. And I do kind of take it for granted that everyone knows what open source is and that open source is ubiquitous and it's everywhere, and we kind of understand that. And then there are events like Log4Shell that really drive home just how ubiquitous open source is. It's in everything. It's in your washing machine. It's in the phlebotomy machine that is examining your blood culture. It's in the software that runs lots of servers. And in everything else, technology-driven. But that's just one part of the puzzle, and we take that for granted. If you're in the open source space, you've probably heard of a software composition analysis tool called Black Duck. It's put out by a company called Synopsys. And this year, they talked about what they were seeing in the code bases they were scanning. And they said that 96% of scanned code bases that they see contain open source components. 96%. I don't know about you, but that tells me that their data is just a little bit off by at least 3%. One of the more interesting facts that they called out in this same report is that when they're looking at those 96% of code bases that contain open source, that the average composition of open source by quantity, by lines of code, is 75%. So for any given code base, we know that there is a 96% chance that they contain open source software. And if they contain open source software, the average is that 75% of the code base is going to be open source. As a development methodology, open source has, in many ways, won. It has become table stakes for innovation. But it wasn't always that way. Open source began as a way to solve problems and to share solutions. It's with a little bit of irony. I was on a plane recently coming to San Diego, and I was getting a call from my wife. And I work for a very large technology company, and so you would think that the technology problems that I have to solve are really complex. My wife's calling me up because she can't print on the printer. And it was a printing problem that served as the genesis for what we know as the modern open source movement. Folks had problems with printing to a Hewlett-Packard printer, and that is what started the idea that we need to be able to have access to source code to solve problems and to be able to share the changes that we make as part of that. Now we can talk about, and you'll see this in lots of people's slide decks, when they talk about open source, they'll tell you you can move so much faster because you're not having to reinvent the wheel. No one wants to write a new web server, right? We have Nginx, we have the Apache web server. No need to go rewrite that stack. And of course, the idea of doing this all in the open means that a lot of those open code bases turn into not just open source software, but open standards. And instead of folks going off in the corner and developing a standard and keeping it hidden behind a bunch of intellectual property licensing that's restrictive, that becomes the de facto standard. And people can easily interoperate because they can look at how things work together. And so it's not just building a top, but now you can connect systems so much easier. And of course, the idea that anyone can go look at these code bases, anyone can improve them, means that the community that surrounds them becomes a community of practice, a community of experts. They can go and help each other and solve things in a way that would make that makes it so much more efficient to share knowledge and to share those solutions to problems. But that is just what we expect out of open source today. Open source has become ubiquitous. People expect it. They expect new innovative technology to be done in the open where everyone can take a look. And that success has some unintended consequences. One of those unintended consequences is that everyone wants to claim, whether they qualify for this or not, that they're open source. We see a lot of news around open source AI today. And by the way, I had to mention generative AI to get a keynote slot, so this is my one generative AI mention. Right? We see a lot of folks who are pushing out foundational models and calling them open source, and yet they don't meet a license definition for that. And frankly, I'm not sure that we have a good definition of what open source AI actually even means. I'm encouraged that there are a number of smart folks, particularly at places like the Open Source Initiative, who are tackling that problem. But open source has become such a moniker for the public good and has such a halo effect that whether it qualifies or not, people want to claim that. And I think that it is important for us as a user of open source to insist that things that are going to call themselves open source actually earn that title. When I'm looking at it, I look at things like the 4 freedoms that the FSF, the Free Software Foundation, calls out. I look at the Debian Free Software Guidelines, and of course the open source definition that the Open Source Initiative calls out. And I think this is such an important part that I want to talk about the things that I see that are most important for something to be open source. And you have to remember that when we created this idea of open source or free software, that it was done in a very different age. And we were thinking about copyright licenses. We weren't thinking about all of the other things that we now think are important to open source. But we were thinking just about the permission to use and redistribute code. And so I want to call out 4 things that I think are mandatory. The open source definition has 10. That's too many for me to keep in my head, and so I have to go look at a list. But I'll tell you the 4 that I think are most important. The first is the ability to use the software in any way that you want. Just because I write some software that tells you how to do something does not mean that I control how you do it or what you do with it. Secondly, you have the freedom to go and inspect how that code works. Now, this presupposes that you're going to have access to source code. If you're not given access to source code of something, it is not open source. So you need to be able to actually look at and study how it works. And the corollary to this is you need the ability to change it. So we've got, you can do anything you want with the software. You can look at how it works and change it. You can share copies of the software with others because we want you to be able to help other people who are having the same problem that you are. And then finally, we want you to be able to, as you improve it, as you change the software, we want you to be able to share your changes as well. When we look back at the history of the Apache Software Foundation, it didn't start out with this idea that we're going to create one of the largest code-generating organizations in the world. We're going to share it all for the public good, and we're going to cause a revolution in the way that people think about big data or Java code bases. It was people who shared patches via email for a web server. They were encountering a common set of problems, and they were making things better for each other. And that is the history of open source. And it's, I think, an important part of what DBT empowers. It empowers people to solve problems and to share other solutions to solving problems. And that's one of the reasons I am so excited about DBT, the project, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But open source has not stopped at just solving problems. Open source is fueling innovation today. Whether we want to talk about big data, we want to talk about cloud-native, scalable systems, the default for that innovation is happening now in open source. Our friends over at Percona Labs did an analysis recently of what are you actually running in terms of databases. This is not a sheer count of databases, but this is looking at how many instance hours, if you're running a database in the cloud, how many instance hours of each type of database are you actually running? And the top is obviously community-supported open source. Projects like PostgreSQL. They have 42% of the market share, if you want to call it that. Of course, other open source, single vendor open source is no slouch there at 23%. So 65% of their data is showing that things are running in open source. I don't know about you, but I do not think of the database industry as the one that is the most change-friendly. And I apologize to any DBAs I'm offending by this, but DBAs get a database and they don't ever want to change away from it. So if you think about just how inertia has set in the database market, the fact that 65% of current workloads are in open source databases is a huge shift in momentum. But when we talk about open source, once we get past the license, right? License is table stakes. You need a license that meets that open source definition. There's a lot more to discuss about how open source fuels innovation. And I think that requires us to think about some of the modalities of open source. And so, first, it's important that you realize that in open source projects and in open source communities, the currency is contributions. And without folks being willing to file bugs, open pull requests, and work on a code base together, open source is just a license. And while those licenses are powerful and they empower users to do a lot, that is a fraction of what is possible in a vibrant, healthy open source project. And so I want to talk a little bit about a community-led partnership. Because the story is not about what AWS is doing It's really not even about what DBT Labs is doing. They're cool and they're doing amazing things. But the thing that is compelling for me is looking at how much this project community is thriving and just how much is happening here. So I work on open source strategy for Amazon. And part of my job involves measuring risk, measuring open source health and vitality, and I've got a data engineering team that helps me do that. And so we looked, and we also worked with DBT Labs in looking at the health and the vibrancy of the DBT community. And these numbers are staggering. There are 90,000 community members. I thought this conference was pretty big for a software conference on a single area of technology. This is a pretty big conference. But it's just a small subset of the DBT project community. 90,000 members. 30,000 companies. And the only reason I call this out is because this is evidence that people are solving real problems today with DBT. 30,000 companies are investing time and money into working on solving problems that many of us have. Of course, DBT is all about integrations. And the fact that in such a short time we have 50 different adapters integrating different technologies together is stunning. But I really want to talk, and I did save this to the last. In the past 12 months, there have been 325 contributors to DBT Core and to the host of 50-plus adapters and a number of other DBT-related code bases. That's a sizable number for an open source project. But when my data engineering folks are looking at health and vitality stats, they're not just looking at, tell me how many commits there are and tell me how many pull requests are accepted. Those are all important. They're also looking at how diverse is that contributor base. Of the 325 contributors to various DBT code bases in the past year, 83% are not affiliated with DBT Labs. That's a stunningly high percentage. In the open source metrics ecosystem, there's this concept that if there is more than 50% of a project being dominated by a single vendor, then the elephant factor is 1. That's a huge risk because then you're dependent upon just one company continuing to make all of the engineering investment. That is not the case here. So I want to take a quick informal poll, and I know that we are slightly skewed by the fact that we had a party last night. But if you've opened a pull request against DBT Core or an adapter or something in this space, will you raise your hand? Okay, keep these hands up. We're going to clap in a minute. You're going to clap for me, but if you've opened an issue, you reported a bug, will you raise your hand? Now I want you to look around. These are the people who are actively contributing. It's not all the contributions, but these are the easy things, right? I would humbly suggest that these people should not have to pay when they get to the bar, and that it is our responsibility as beneficiaries of their contributions to bear that for them. Please give these folks and yourselves as members of the DBT community a huge round of applause. I don't think you understand, especially sitting inside this project community, just how special it is to build an open source project that is as healthy and vibrant as the DBT community is. We can talk about just how effective DBT Labs is at trying to curate and cultivate a very welcoming and healthy project. But really, that is what you're doing as the community at this point. You have created a place that is welcoming to other folks. You've created a place that is free and has permission to innovate. As a matter of fact, one of the first AWS contributions is a great example of that permissionless innovation. Benjamin Minuet, who is an engineer who works with a lot of our customers, saw folks who were struggling with wanting to have Spark workloads, wanting to interact with them via DBT, and doing so via Glue. And Glue is an Amazon, an AWS service that essentially exposes a Spark environment to you in a serverless manner. And he had folks who wanted to make use of that with DBT. In his spare time, he started working on an adapter for Glue. And I say spare time because he was watching what his customers were struggling with and thought, you know, everybody's really excited about DBT, including me, and it's really easy to build an adapter. And so Benjamin went and developed an adapter for Amazon Glue and provided that as open source software. Did that all in his spare time. He didn't have to ask AWS for permission. He did have to ask for permission to actually open source it, but not to build it. He didn't have to ask DBT Labs for permission. As a matter of fact, I don't think he even talked to DBT Labs at the time when he first wrote it. He saw a problem that his customers were having and said, I want to go solve that problem. And that is the success story of open source, right? You don't need my permission. You don't need Tristan's permission. You don't need to go ask people, can I go solve somebody else's problem? You're empowered to go do that. And so that was to my knowledge, that was the first AWS contribution to DBT, was solving a customer problem. That's now being actively maintained by more folks than Benjamin, but is a great example of having this ability to identify problems that other people have, being able to actively work and develop software that solves that problem and delivers an innovative solution. Of course, AWS probably should really be doing more, but I want to talk about some folks who solved a problem for us and our customers that don't work for us. So these 5 folks that you see on the screen, they wanted to provide an adapter for Amazon Athena. Again, they did not come to AWS and said, we really think there needs to be one. Please go do this for us. They also didn't ask for permission. They went and created an Athena adapter, and these 5 folks are the maintainers of that adapter. I don't think any of them are here today. I know I checked with a couple. If you're here, please yell and scream at me, or just make sure that I get your bar tab. But these folks went and created an adapter for Amazon Athena. And again, they were trying to solve their own problems. These are problems that they had, and they started working together. And this is something that an open source project, if it's run well, will do. It will facilitate bringing together multiple people with the same type or class of problem and allow them to collaborate together so that they are doing less work as a whole than they would have to do if they were solving it individually. And so I do want to say thank you to these folks. These folks saw a need, solved their own problem, and in turn, by making it open source, shared that solution with the world. Of course, we get back to why does AWS care about dbt? And we care most because our customers care. And several years ago, we started seeing people telling us that dbt was an important part of their data modernization strategy. And frankly, many of us were like, dbt, I've never heard of this. And started looking, realized that it was an open source project, realized that it wasn't just a couple of our customers, but many of our customers were making use of this. And as folks were migrating lots of data and databases to the cloud, as they're trying to modernize their data strategy, as they're trying to automate things and build data pipelines, they were increasingly relying on dbt. And dbt became a core part of that. So of course, today, dbt integrates with Redshift, Glue, and Athena. But of course, our customers are not only using AWS services. dbt, again, has more than 50 adapters. And so our customers are using integrations with things like Snowflake and Redshift and Spark and the whole gamut of things because very few places are single vendor. And because of this ability to solve across multiple different services and different pieces of software, that has driven a lot of value for our customers. And so we're incredibly thankful for that, and we've recognized that we need to contribute. And so we're looking at where we can be more involved in this project. And there are a number of AWS software engineers who are already working here. I'm sure that you may see them and not even realize that they work for us. But we're working on features and bug fixes inside both dbt core and the adapters. We're trying to prioritize our customers' feature requests to improve dbt core and, of course, the adapters themselves. We're trying to share best practices so that when you're trying to integrate with things like Redshift, you actually understand the best and most efficient way to do that. Frankly, that was probably the genesis of some of our early contributions. The original Redshift connector was actually really a PostgreSQL connector because both Redshift and dbt spoke PostgreSQL. So we used a different interpretation layer. And it worked and worked well, but maybe not the most efficient way to do that. And so when we were looking at the things that I want to celebrate, we saw the Redshift adapter and started working to make that more efficient. We wanted to add support for materialized views, again, so our customers could be more efficient with their data pipelines. And this is where we plan to continue to make our investments, is improving both the core of dbt, making sure that it is as bug-free as possible, and also that when our customers, whether they're using our services or not, are building these data pipelines and are modernizing their data strategy, that they're doing so in the most efficient way possible. This is part of how AWS thinks about investing in open source. I told you that I have a data engineering and a business intelligence team that's focused on measuring risk for open source software. And a lot of this is because open source is a thing you can be and also be unhealthy. Everyone is familiar with that XKCD cartoon talking about the one guy in Nebraska who has built the one piece of software that the entire world depends upon. We do not believe that's healthy for the open source community to have to engage in that way. And so we are focused on making sure that the open source software that we and our customers depend upon is sustainable. That there is not just a healthy code base, and we want a healthy code base. We want one that's bug-free and that's secure and that's well-maintained, but we also want healthy communities surrounding it. We don't want there to be a situation where there's one person who the entire world is depending upon and he's bearing that burden all by himself. And so diverse contributions are an important part of what we are looking for when we're making investments in open source, when we're recommending open source solutions to our customers. We don't want them to take a solution that may be obsolete in 2 years because no one can take the time to contribute to it. And so the community around DBT is an excellent example of a very healthy and vibrant open source community. There are regular bug fixes coming in. There's regular permission to innovate and to build new adapters. No one's gating that type of activity. And we are super excited to be partnering with DBT Labs. We hope that our customers are getting outsized benefit, particularly from this being open source. And I want to say it, I harped on people trying to claim open source and wear that as a badge of honor without having met the prerequisites for being called open source. And I'm really encouraged. I'm sure if you saw Tristan's keynote, you saw him stake the claim that they were going to stick with the Apache license. They're going to stick to being open source. That's not an easy thing to do in the economic environment of having to build a company alongside a community and making sure that the company remains viable and healthy as well as that community. And so I think there is a lot to appreciate, not just in how healthy the community is, but I think the folks at DBT Labs, from their open source strategy, deserve a lot of praise for making that kind of commitment, because that's really a commitment to their users, and I'm using the word users in particular, not customers, right? Because the majority of folks who are consuming DBT probably are never going to pay DBT Labs a cent. And yet, Tristan gets up here on stage and makes a commitment to stay open source. That's a big commitment. I do want to talk for just a moment into why AWS cares about open source. I've said we care about sustainable open source and we want projects to be healthy, and we certainly do. But as I imagine many of you, we are built on open source. When EC2 came out, it was built atop the Zen hypervisor. Before that, we introduced S3. This is 2006. S3 was built atop Apache Tomcat. EC2, S3, and the rest of the AWS cloud would not exist if open source didn't. It would have taken us many more years to develop those underlying technologies. And because we build on it, we need that foundation to be incredibly healthy. Of course, it's not just what we're building. Our customers are choosing it. And if they let me actually edit my own slides, I'd probably say our customers are demanding it. The number of customers that I talk to who have a open source first mandate is increasing every month. We've got folks who want to have their solutions as open source, And that can be because they think they can improve it or because they think it keeps them away from vendor lock-in. But whether it's an open source database, an open source web server, or any of the other pieces of technology, customers are demanding open source as a key component in their technology stacks. And of course, we also have this idea of the world depending upon open source. Again, 96% of code bases contain open source software, and when they do, 75% of the code base is going to be open source. We have a shared fate. Whether you're a large technology company like AWS, a small startup, a small and medium business, we have to accept the reality that we have a shared fate in open source. And that means we have a shared responsibility. And I'm sure that you are probably not thinking of it in these terms when you think about how DBT, the project, exists today. But as a group here today, and the folks who are online, and the folks we're going to interact with on Slack, and the folks on GitHub, we have a shared fate. And that means that we can invest our time and our energy into improving things, into making them better, into improving our shared destiny. And so I want to invite you, first of all, to get more involved. You saw the folks who raised their hands and said, I submitted a pull request. Some of my code is in DBT. I filed issues. I told them how they got it wrong. This should be the easy one, right? Somebody on the internet's wrong. We can all do that. Please think about making an investment here, because I think that DBT is a shining example of a stellar open source project community. And I appreciate you letting me come talk to you about it. This is one of the most exciting communities that I've seen in a while. And I am excited about what's going to develop out of here. I'm excited that the community is so enthusiastic and so hugely contributing to the future of what's going to be DBT. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I appreciate you coming out this early, especially after the party on a beautiful day in San Diego. Thanks so much.